Okay, good morning. If you're on the West Coast, good afternoon. If you're in a different part of the map, my name is Nina Lozano. I am a member of the Tempest Collective, and I would like to welcome you all this morning to our event titled Afghanistan, Islamophobia, and US Imperialism. If you like what you hear today, you can visit us at tempestmag.org. That's tempestmag.org. You can join and read more about who we are there. And I would like to remind you today just a few timekeeping issues. One is housekeeping issues. One, if you could please keep your mic muted while others are speaking. Also, I'm going to be introducing the speakers all at the beginning, and we're going to go in order. And then we're going to have time for Q&A afterward. And then if you could speak a little bit about the timekeeping right now, please, so everyone's aware.
Yeah, I'm Bill Keach. I'm the Tempest Collective, and I'll be keeping time on people who participate in the discussion. We'll give each of you a maximum of 3 minutes just to make sure that as many people as possible can participate in the discussion. And when you're speaking, if you get to 2.5 minutes, I'll give you a warning that you have 30 more seconds and need to wrap up in that time frame. That's the way it'll work.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Additionally, there are some people watching this event live on Facebook. I will remind you at the end of the speakers that if you'd like to participate in the Q&A, you can move over to the Zoom format, and we will remind you again as we get closer. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce our 3 amazing speakers. It's really an honor for me to be here to introduce you to these folks today. Our first speaker is Rory Fanning. Rory walked across the United States for the Pat Tillman Foundation in 2008 to 2009, following 2 deployments to Afghanistan with the 2nd Army Ranger Battalion. He is the author of Worth Fighting For, an Army Ranger's journey out of the military and across America, put out by Haymarket in 2014. He regularly speaks at high schools and universities about his walk across the US and his experience as a war resistor. You may follow him on Twitter at capital R, capital T, capital F, Fanning, that's RT Fanning on Twitter. Our next speaker will be Deepa Kumar. She is professor of media studies at Rutgers University. Her most recent book is the 2nd and fully revised edition of Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, 20 years after 9/11, published by Verso in 2021. Our final speaker today is Phil Gasper. Phil is a member of the Tempest Collective and a longtime anti-war activist. He has written numerous articles on US foreign policy and is the editor of Imperialism and War, classic writings by V.I. Lenin and Nikolai Bukharin, and his book is with Haymarket in 2017. So I will at this time turn the floor over to Rory. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be with you virtually today. We are, well, this is 20 years in, 2001. It all started with those planes hitting the Twin Towers. 20 years later, we're still talking about the US occupation in Afghanistan. It's hard to know where to begin. 20 years in, talking about the origins of it, who's responsible for it, all the death and destruction that has happened since 2001, to say nothing of what has happened at the hands of the US military before that point in time. Without necessarily knowing how to narrow it down, I'm going to talk about what I think I know the most about, and that's how kids end up signing up to fight for the US military. I was a recent college graduate when I decided I was going to sign up for the military. I saw the planes hit the Twin Towers. I wanted to do my part to prevent something like that from ever happening again. I was looking for a little adventure. I was looking for some meaning in my life. I had a mound of student debt. And I was also, looking for a bit of a rite of passage. At 21, I didn't know if I was a kid or adult at that point in time. And so the military seemed like a noble thing to do. I thought the US fought for freedom and democracy around the world. I believed, what my high school teachers told me, because they only emphasized the good points in US history. So it took me going to Afghanistan and seeing this unbelievably poor country that had just been occupied by Russians, embroiled in a civil war. I saw tanks littering the landscape, Russian airplanes littering the landscape, gaping holes in the sides of buildings in Kabul, and I didn't know when I landed in Afghanistan that the Taliban had surrendered about a month before we arrived. And our job was essentially to draw the Taliban back into the fight. And it really didn't even have to be the Taliban. The US was just interested in fighting, I think in large parts to maintain Cold War era military budgets. But that $1 trillion a year, quote unquote, defense budget is pretty hard to walk away from if you're an owner of one of these major weapons manufacturers. And, to say nothing about the US, desire to grow the empire, maintain spheres of influence in all corners of the world, steal other countries' natural resources. But I wasn't thinking about that when I signed up. I didn't understand power structures. I just thought, I wanted to defend my country. I also was a fairly alienated person. I didn't, know what was, up or down when I was 21 years old. And I saw the military as a chance to kind of bond with other maybe kids who were in my position. And so I signed up, and I got there and I was very disappointed by what I saw. I immediately felt like a bully. We would have rockets land in our camp, and we would call in airstrikes, 500-pound bombs that would land in general vicinities, nothing targeted. So we know that about 80%, between 80 and 85% of everybody who has died since 2001 has been an innocent civilian. Just yesterday, I think the Pentagon was probably caught in a lie. I think they knew right away that they had killed 10 children, 10 people, 10 Afghans, 7 of them being children on August 29th. And I think it was found out that it was in fact another civilian casualty. The massacre, I think, is probably the best way of putting it. And the US had to apologize. Of course, no accountability. I mean, what world can you kill, 7 children and not be held accountable? The Pentagon it does this on a regular basis. They spent the last 20 years, they spent the last 100 years, 150 years. This is the beginning of the United States, I guess, slaughtering people and not being held accountable for it. And, and the world is a much more dangerous place 20 years after the US decided it was going to occupy Afghanistan. One of the statistics I like to mention in these talks is, between 1980 and 2001, there were 300 suicide bombs around the world, with only 10% aimed at the US or US interests. Between 2001 and 2012 alone, there was 2,500 suicide bombs, with 90% aimed at the US or US interests. So I hoped I could make the world a safer place by signing up for the military. And I was realizing that I was only making the world a more dangerous place by occupying Afghanistan. People who couldn't even point to Manhattan on the map suddenly had a vested interest in figuring out, how to take revenge on the fact that the US just killed their entire family. Or, one of the things that we used to do a lot is land in people's backyards in the middle of the night based on, CIA intelligence. So we got to go get this member of the Taliban, put a bag over that person's head, and they'd be sent off to a place like Guantanamo or the like. We'd come to find out that that person was caught up in a village dispute, was not even a member of the Taliban. And the landlord said, look at this, very wealthy country coming in with tons of cash. I'm going to get rid of this problem tenant. And that was most of our, and this wasn't exceptions. This was kind of the rule. US, working off of horrible intelligence. And so anyway, now I go into schools. I try to talk about the fact, I can't believe I'm already up to 10 minutes. So let me wrap this up. I go into schools across the country and try to fill in the blanks of all the things the 10,000 military recruiters don't leave in when they are trying to convince kids to sign up to work in one of the 800 military bases have around the world. I talk about the fact that most of the people who you are sent off to kill and end up dying are just ordinary people like you and I. The kids can tell you very little about the last 20 years of the US occupation, much less the 100 years prior to that. And I think it's really important that we do our best to try to interrupt that moment where kids who are looking for a little bit of structure, because the US military targets the people with the least amount of options after graduation. And they target people on the south and west sides of Chicago. The Chicago is one of the greatest pools for recruiting if you're a military recruiter. We have more than 10,000 kids signed up for the JROTC program in the United States, in Chicago alone. And I think it's important for us to at least do our best to push back against the US military's $1 billion a year advertising budget and its constant drive to recruit and put kids in a position where they should never be in. Kids, most of the time, they're just looking for ways to pay for college, or find a little bit of structure and, feel less alienated in the world. And that's why you have to connect US imperialism to free education, to free healthcare, to the fight against climate change. People, the US military is the largest polluter on the planet. And a lot of people don't think about that type of thing. And so I'm going to wrap it up there. We're always already at an hour and 15 minutes. I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists and then maybe having some question and answer or discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. That was amazing. So I'm going to spend the time that I have talking about imperial feminism, that is the weaponization of feminism, and just how racist the entire logic of imperial feminism is. I'd like to start with an op-ed that Thomas Friedman, someone we all, let's say not have a lot of respect for, had in the New York Times recently, where he posed the question of whether the US has shaped Middle East policies in its efforts to get the region to, quote, embrace pluralism and the rule of law, end quote, or if in intervening in the region, it has wound up mimicking the Middle East in terms of its tribalism. Now, presumably somebody who supports women's rights, particularly the right to abortion, created the image that I'm just about to show you. Just give me 1 second. I have 3 images that I'd like to share in this presentation. Let me pull this up. Okay, so people can see this image, I think. You see the 3 women wearing burqas, right? And I'm going to stop sharing at that point and explain why I think this is problematic. Now, the logic behind this person's, argument is essentially that somehow the attack on women's rights. Have I managed to stop sharing? Can you still see it, or You can't see it. Yeah, okay. So this image appeared on social media shortly after the Supreme Court voted 5-4 to not block a Texas law that prohibits most abortions in that state. And the logic here is that the Supreme Court mimicked the Middle East or the Taliban in bringing alien values to the US. And the Supreme Court ruling, as well as the end of US occupation in Afghanistan, as people know, occurred at more or less the same moment, about 1 day apart. If the Afghan pullout ended on August 31st, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict on September 1st. And this was, of course, also the moment when the media were awash in stories of Afghan women's plight under Taliban rule. And the key framework in the media by pundits and the political elite and others was how decades of progress under US occupation would be undone by the Taliban. In reality, even US government's reports have attested that while some policies that negatively impacted Afghan women may have ended with the fall of the Taliban, and I'm quoting them directly, many continue in practice, even in government-controlled areas, that is US-backed government-controlled areas. And years of war have left millions of women maimed, widowed, impoverished, and displaced, end quotes. The report suggests that the reason there was limited progress is because of Afghan cultural norms. So the logic behind, Friedman's op-ed, the Supreme Court image, and this National Intelligence Council report that I just read out to you, what undergirds these three pieces is a clash of civilizations argument, right? Which is a form of cultural racism that sees the West and the Muslim world as being diametrically opposed to one another, with the former, i.e. the West being the bastion of women's rights, and the latter as being misogynistic and barbaric, and therefore it is the white man's burden to go off and liberate brown women from brown men. And even though the US tried to civilize these people, the narrative claims, it failed. Why? Because of their own backwardness. Instead, the purity of US culture has been tarnished. That is, strange values apparently don't have any history in the US, but they come in from the outside and taint, this pure society. And so what you see at work is really the weaponization of feminism in service to empire, what's been called imperial feminism, which is a deeply racist framework. At its core, imperial feminism relies not only on an erasure of women and their agency, right? That Afghan women actually are agents of liberation and have been fighting for their own rights. It not only erases Afghan women's agency, but it also erases the agency of women right here in the United States. So absent from this picture is the notion that it took no less than a century of struggle by women suffragists, for instance, just to secure the right to vote. So I have one more image. This is a cartoon that appeared in opposition to the women's suffrage movement back in the early 20th century, and I'll share that with you and then make a few comments. Origin and development of a suffragette. At 15, a little pet. At 20, a little coquette. At 40, not married yet. At 50, a suffragette. Right, so you get the idea of the line of argumentation here. So in other words, there was really a concerted effort to try to stop women from getting the right to vote. And these sorts of, this was actually a postcard. These sorts of sentiments were quite rife in the US. And this was not a product of, the Taliban or some colonial encounter with backward people, but very much a product of deep-rooted sexism right here in the United States. Similarly, it took a women's movement to win not only the right to terminate a pregnancy, but as women of color feminists fought for and argue, the right to carry a pregnancy to term and not be forced to undergo sterilization, right? So the term that's been given is reproductive rights rather than abortion rights. And yet almost immediately after Roe v. Wade was passed, the right in the US has sought to undermine reproductive rights. So that's on the one hand, right, the erasure of the struggles that it has taken to win even basic rights for women, which are now under attack again with the Texas law and so forth. On the other hand, we've also seen the erasure of the agency of women in the global South. So RAWA, which is the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, and their movement for women's rights is all but absent in mainstream accounts of the US war in Afghanistan. RAWA, as you may know, was founded in 1977 as a group that advocated for women's rights. Its founder, Meena, was killed in 1987 by Afghan agents of the KGB in connivance with US agents, particularly the warlord Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who, according to Rawa's website, people may know who this person is. He was one of the most notorious leaders of the Mujahideen. There were several Mujahideen factions, and he was the one who was part of a faction that was most funded by the United States. Tim Weiner and other journalists have written about him, and this is what they say, quote, Hekmatyar's followers first gain attention by throwing acid in the faces of women who refuse to wear the veil. And Weiner's CIA and State Department sources described Hekmatyar as scary, vicious, a fascist, and definite dictatorship material. Yet they supported him in order to advance US imperial interests. Now, RAWA has opposed US intervention right from the start and demanded that the US and NATO forces withdraw. In a recent interview that Solali Kolhatkar of the Afghan Women's Mission conducted with RAWA, the organization stated quite clearly that, quote, over the past 20 years, one of our demands was the end of US-NATO occupation. And they go on to add, quote, even better if they, i.e. the US, take their Islamic fundamentalists and technocrats with them and let our people decide our own fate. This occupation only resulted in bloodshed, destruction, and chaos. They turned our country into the most corrupt, insecure drug mafia and a dangerous place, especially for women, end quote. However, we would be hard pressed to find the voice of RAWA in the mainstream media, save a few rare op-ed here and there. If anything, to the extent that we've seen Afghan women protesting Taliban rule in the mainstream media, it's framed in such a way as to suggest that somehow the US occupation made it possible, right? Never mind that, women have been fighting since the 1970s. So again, you see Afghan feminists and women's rights organizations being erased and invisibilized. Finally, and I'll start to wrap up with this, it's worth reflecting, I think, on the longer history in the West of externalizing and blaming problems in Western nations on the global South. So today, for instance, you can buy a t-shirt of Biden wearing a turban and a slogan, a turban and a scarf with the slogan, "Make the Taliban great again." Now, there's no doubt that these t-shirts are made by Trump supporters for Trump supporters and Trump fans, and they're quite obviously reversing Trump's slogan of "Make America Great Again." But in case you missed this, a couple of days ago, a series of billboards were have popped up all over Pennsylvania, which is the work of a former senator from the state with exactly the same image. So let me share that. That's my final image. Oh, I'm sorry. There you go. making the Taliban great again. And you see Biden, in case you can't see that, that is Biden, turban, scarf, right? So, what you see at work here is essentially an attempt to externalize what this senator sees as a foreign influence on US politics, right? Biden's garb suggests that this has somehow come in from the outside, and that what's wrong with America, which in the imagination of white supremacists is a white nation that should be restored to its lost glory, what's wrong is Taliban influence, supposedly. Now, this is, of course, what Friedman is also arguing. And these articulations actually hark back all the way to the discussion of Nazism in the 20th century. Aimé Césaire, in his book, Discourse on Colonialism, argued forcefully that the genocide of Jews in Europe was nothing but the application internally of what European colonial powers had been practicing externally, and that the two were intimately tied. He argued that European fascism, even beyond Germany, applied practices to white people that were, quote, until then, reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the N-word of Africa, end quote. In short, fascism in its various manifestations were very much a product of factors internal to Europe, argued Césaire. And the reason he argued this is because there were many explanations that suggested that, oh, it's because of the encounter with the barbaric colonized other that Europe has become barbaric. And he pushed back against this, as did W.E.B. Du Bois in his book, The World in Africa. And I'll end with this quote from Du Bois. He says, quote, there was no atrocity, concentration camps, wholesale maiming and murder, defilement of women, or ghastly blasphemy of childhood, which Christian civilization or Europe had not long been practicing against colored folks in all parts of the world, in the name of and for the defense of a superior race born to rule the world, end quote. So it therefore behooves people who identify with the left to eschew arguments that blame the Taliban or the Middle East for the attack on women's rights in the US, because such an argument is racist and only works to reinforce white supremacy and empire. In other words, this is not just a right-wing argument, but it's also something that unfortunately some sections of the liberal establishment, including some liberals and left, have also adopted themselves. And I'll come to a close with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Deepa, and thank you, Rory. We will now hear from Phil.
Yeah, thanks so much to Rory and Deepa for their presentations. I want to put Afghanistan in the context of US imperialism more generally. And by US imperialism, I mean US empire building, the attempt to control as much of the world as possible in the interests of the American ruling class. So last weekend, on the anniversary of the September 11th attacks, the media spent a considerable amount of time remembering the lives of the nearly 3,000 people who were killed on that day. Each one of those victims deserves to be remembered, but the commemoration also made me think of the victims of US imperialism, who number not in the thousands, but in the millions. If we attempted to remember their lives in the same way, their achievements, hopes, dreams, and so on, we would have to spend the entire year in mourning. As Rory mentioned, the United States has been an expansionist power since its founding in the 18th century. It became a world power in the 20th century. And since World War II, the central goal of US foreign policy has been to maintain and extend its position as the world's most dominant power. In public, US foreign policy is justified in terms of grand principles like extending democracy, protecting human rights, defending international law, and so on. But in reality, it is always governed by the goals of controlling the resources and territory needed to maintain US global dominance. In 1948, an internal State Department policy planning document written by George Kennan, he was one of Harry Truman's key foreign policy advisors and a major figure in shaping US policy in the post-war era. Kennan outlined US goals in very blunt terms. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we are going to have to deal in straight power concepts. The less we are then hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. And Kennan is talking about what planners say to each other in private, not what the public is going to hear. So those unreal objectives which he mentions, yes, they remain the standard method of trying to sell the policy, but internally they are talking about straight power concepts, as he puts it. The goal of dominating a so-called grand area that is strategically necessary for world control was the underlying rationale for repeated US interventions, overthrowing governments and resulting in the death of millions of people in Indochina, the Far East, the Middle East, Latin America, even Europe, in the second half of the 20th century. All told, Washington has used its military forces to violently intervene in foreign countries well over 200 times since the Second World War. For much of this time, the US, of course, was involved in a global confrontation with the Soviet Union. It sparked a massive arms race, with each side building thousands of nuclear missiles. But it was called a Cold War because while they used their military power to intervene in numerous other countries, thankfully, neither superpower attacked the other. But it was the Cold War with the Soviet Union that was the catalyst for the first phase of US involvement in Afghanistan. In the late 1970s, the US was smarting from its defeat in Vietnam and looking for ways to rebuild its ability to intervene around the world. In 1978, a military coup in Afghanistan brought a pro-Soviet government to power. The new government attempted to implement social reforms, but it did it in a very heavy-handed way. And within a few months, it was facing armed opposition in the countryside from conservative Islamic groups. The US government now saw an opportunity. From the summer of 1979, it began secretly funneling support to the Afghan rebels. The strategy was later spelled out by Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. He said in an interview, it was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. With Afghanistan spiraling towards civil war and a power struggle breaking out between different factions in the Afghan government, the Soviet Union sent in troops in December 1979. And that same day, Brzezinski sent Carter a letter. We now have the opportunity of giving to the USSR its Vietnam War. And that, in effect, is what happened. The Soviet occupation lasted for almost a decade. It was a brutal and bloody affair, just like the US occupation of Vietnam. It left over 1 million Afghans dead. But just like the US in Vietnam, the Soviets were never able to defeat the rebel forces, the Mujahideen or Holy Warriors, who were receiving billions of dollars of aid, first from Carter and then from Reagan. The CIA also encouraged tens of thousands of Islamic radicals to come to Afghanistan from other countries to fight the Soviets. They received training and weapons from the Pakistani security services, the ISI, which was paid for by US taxpayers. The US was willing to back totally reactionary forces in Afghanistan to win the Cold War. And it worked. The occupation was a huge financial burden for Moscow, which finally withdrew in February 1989. Most commentators think that the impact of the war played a significant role in the collapse of the Soviet government 2 years later. So the US had won the Cold War, but it had also created a huge network of Islamic radicals trained in guerrilla tactics. One of the first non-Afghan volunteers encouraged by the CIA to join this holy war was Osama bin Laden, who came from a wealthy construction family in Saudi Arabia and had close ties to the Saudi royal family. Bin Laden recruited thousands of volunteers from numerous countries and developed close relations with the most radical Mujahideen leaders. At the end of the war, he created Al-Qaeda, a network of terrorist cells in at least 26 countries. During the 90s, the network that the US had helped create was linked to terrorist attacks in the Philippines, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, France, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, China, Egypt, Algeria, and Morocco. For most of this time, the US considered this a price worth paying for defeating the Soviet Union. Then in 1998, Al-Qaeda bombed the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And in 2000, it bombed the USS Cole. The 9/11 attacks came less than a year after that. This is what the CIA calls blowback, an analogy with using chemical weapons to defeat your opponent, only to have them blow back onto your own troops. So now we get the second phase of US involvement in Afghanistan. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US became the world's only superpower. And it now became a goal of US policy to cement this dominance into place for as long as possible by preventing the emergence of a new global rival. In particular, this meant keeping China, whose economy was booming in the 1990s, in a subordinate position. And there were different strategies for trying to do this, but one of them was to reassert US control over the Middle East. Before Bush came to office in 2001, several of the people who would have leading roles in his administration formed the Project for a New American Century. In a major report, the project announced that its goal was maintaining global US preeminence and shaping the international security order in line with American principles and interests. This would include using overwhelming military force to take control of the Gulf region with its strategically vital oil resources. The report also noted that to implement such aggressive policies, some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor, would be needed. From that perspective, the 9/11 attacks offered the Bush administration a golden opportunity to put into effect plans that it already wanted to pursue. In the days immediately following 9/11, we know that discussion in the White House focused on whether it would be possible to attack Iraq in response. But it was reluctantly concluded that at this point, Iraq, which of course had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks, was a bridge too far. What they could get away with immediately was building an international coalition to invade Afghanistan. The plan was that this could then serve as a stepping stone for a later attack on Iraq. The public justification for the war was that the Taliban government was harboring Osama bin Laden, the alleged mastermind of the September 11th attacks. But the Bush administration was never serious about capturing bin Laden, who was much more useful to them as a bogeyman. Offers by the Taliban regime in Afghanistan to hand bin Laden over were ignored. The initial invasion was a one-sided rout. The Taliban was quickly swept aside, and the US and its allies began the process of trying to put in place a stable government that would be beholden to US and Western interests. But almost as soon as the first phase of the war was over, the Bush administration began turning its attention to Iraq, first by making completely implausible claims that Iraq's president, Saddam Hussein, was in league with al-Qaeda, then by spreading the lie that Iraq was in possession of weapons of mass destruction and claiming that this justified a preemptive attack. Now, controlling Middle Eastern oil was a central part of the equation, but Washington also hoped that a US military presence at the heart of the landmass extending from European Russia to China would serve to keep both these rivals in check. If these were Washington's goals, it has totally failed to achieve them. Far from keeping Russia and China in check, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq trapped the US in a quagmire. At the end of 2 decades, China has emerged as a more powerful military and economic competitor. Meanwhile, Afghanistan and Iraq, along with other parts of the Middle East and Africa, have been devastated. The Costs of War project at Brown University estimated recently that over 900,000 people have been killed as a result of the US so-called war on terror.
Phil, you're about 12 minutes now.
Thanks. Other estimates put the numbers even higher than that. The total cost of these wars has been over $8 trillion, a vast expenditure for a series of imperialist adventures that, from the US government's own point of view, have left it weaker, not stronger. Biden's decision to withdraw troops was based on the calculation that the occupation was no longer serving US imperial interests. His administration also miscalculated that the US-backed government in Kabul would be able to hold out at least until the US had withdrawn. The fact that the government of Ashraf Ghani and the Afghan military collapsed like a house of cards was simply proof of the folly of the whole enterprise. In a speech at the end of last month, Biden claimed that the US government had learned the lessons of Afghanistan. In reality, I think it has learned nothing. The withdrawal from Afghanistan represents not the end of US imperialism, but simply a new phase in which the administration intends to prioritize great power competition with Russia and especially China. Obama attempted but failed to make a pivot to Asia during his second term. Biden hopes that disentangling from Afghanistan will allow him to succeed where Obama did not. But whether or not he can complete the shift remains an open question. Following the suicide bombings outside the Kabul airport in the final days of the withdrawal in August, the New York Times reported that history had got in the way of US attempts to extricate itself from Afghanistan. It said, American officials are reworking plans to counter threats that could emerge from Afghanistan's chaos, according to current and former officials, negotiating for new bases in Central Asian countries, determining how clandestine officers can run sources in the country, and figuring out from where the CIA could launch drone strikes and other Afghanistan operations. For the rest of us, neither scenario, continued US covert involvement in Afghanistan or a successful pivot to Asia, gives us anything to cheer about. Of course, what we'll get is probably both. Continued drone strikes in Afghanistan, killing more civilians, together with an escalation of the conflict with China. The AUKUS security pact between the US, Australia, and the UK, announced a few days ago, is just the latest ratcheting up of the tension. Meanwhile, Biden has continued the tariffs on Chinese imports first imposed by Trump. We're unlikely to see direct military confrontation between the US and China in the immediate future, but we don't just need to avoid open war. We need serious international cooperation to address the worsening climate crisis. Instead, the US commitment to maintaining the American empire is increasing the likelihood of climate catastrophe. So the US has leapt out of the Afghanistan frying pan and into the fire of open confrontation with China. Ultimately, of course, these geopolitical and military conflicts are rooted in the way that capitalism operates as an international system. And that leaves us with an enormous challenge. We need to build movements that can not only respond to immediate crises, but can also fight for a fundamentally different kind of society. I know it's a left-wing cliche, but just as in the past, we're faced with the choice of socialism or barbarism.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you again to all of our amazing speakers here with us this morning. We would now like to open it up for questions and or comments. And again, if you are on the Facebook Live stream, now's your time to switch over to the Zoom link if you'd like to participate in the comment and question portion of our event. So any questions or comments for our